Now let's talk about the global scope. Our JavaScript as it sits here may not be the only JavaScript that's being loaded on a page. In fact, for large web apps, you end up using a lot of different JavaScript files that many of them may be loaded in memory for your particular page. So you start to run into the problem of collision. What if commonly used variables, function names are being used by different files? Because the way that JavaScript works is that as files are loaded, they may overwrite what other files do. So what if we have two different JavaScript files that both define a variable called ELE? The second JavaScript file that defined ELE would override this one. This one would disappear, would eventually be garbage collected out of existence. Same with main. And so we could start to use really specific names, like I could say site.js ELE, to make sure that we don't have that sort of collision. But that's not really what you want. We're getting this collision because all of our code here is being executed in what's called the global scope. And a scope is simply sort of a container for names. So every named piece, variables, functions, etc., get attached to this global scope. And in the case of web development, that global scope is actually at the window level, so that whatever is in that browser window, usually on that individual tab, all get loaded in that same scope. So we want to have a way to sort of minimize adding things to this global namespace, this global scope. One of the things we learn quickly in JavaScript is that functions provide their own scope. So things created inside of a function aren't visible outside the function because the function itself has its own private scope. So you don't have to worry about this collision. So a common solution to this is to just wrap this all in a function. Let me call it something like startup. So in this case, any code outside of this function doesn't know about all the private information inside of it. But if we go ahead and call startup, right as this is loaded, we're hiding most of the guts, most of the ugliness of what used to be global objects inside the function. In fact, if we save this and show this in the browser, we'll see all the code is still executing, right? But having to do this particular idea, we're still leaking a name into that global scope. This file may be overriding some other function out there called startup in another JavaScript file. Managing that is difficult, so we don't really want to do that. And so the pattern in JavaScript is something that goes by a couple of different names. Either it can be a self-executing anonymous function, or sometimes referred to as an immediately invoked function expression. The idea about whichever way you call this is a nameless function that is then executed immediately. The way we do this is we can get rid of the name of a function. So this becomes an anonymous function. It's still a function and can be executed, but it doesn't have a name for it to be executed under. And so if we wrap it all in parentheses, this ends up being one big expression. This expression returns a function. Therefore, to execute it, we can add two parentheses to say execute. We could actually supply parameters here as parameters into this function. But in most cases, what we want in a self-executing anonymous function or an immediately invoked function expression is just to define this as a function, declare it outside the global scope, and then immediately execute it so that the code actually gets run. You can see if we take this new form and refresh the page again, that code is still executing, but now it's executing outside the global scope, so we don't have to worry about all that name collision nuisance. Next, let's introduce an idea about dependencies in JavaScript.